This is Rejected Knowledge, and this is Chapter 15 of a rather rejected book from 1938 called Lords of the Press by George Seldes. Chapter 15, Gannett, Chain Lord. Throughout the world, journalists have risen to power. Lenin and Trotsky published their small revolutionary papers in Russia and abroad. Stalin edited Pravda in Petrograd during the Kerensky regime, which it helped overthrow. Mussolini was the big shot in socialist journalism in Italy, until the French government paid him to establish and edit a pro-Ally paper, and on its presses fascism began its advance. Kemal Ataturk once ran a rebel sheet. Hitler had his Beobachter. Every French premier has a personal organ. In Europe, the press is an open weapon with which men and parties fight for power. In America, the ruling parties prefer to let the press maintain the aspect of impartiality and independence, so long as wealth, the profit motive, and the status quo are never endangered. There is, however, very little difference between the European and American press in fundamentals. But one striking feature is obvious. In Europe, the editors and publishers themselves become part of the political machinery, whereas in America, they have not yet stepped into the public light. The only American editor and publisher who ever became president was the most tragic incompetent the White House had ever seen. In his reign, the building became merely an office for the greatest bunch of crooks that ever looted the country. The cabinet itself was distinguished for the fact that it supplied the only member of a presidential family ever to enter a federal penitentiary. Unfortunately, scores of even greater crooks remained unjailed. In the Great Ohio Gang scandal, newspaper editors played various roles. Carl C. McGee, editor of the Albuquerque Morning Journal, Paul Y. Anderson of the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, and the Kansas City Star were the heroes, but others, notably Alexander P. Moore of the Pittsburgh Leader, who was never exposed, Tannen and Bonfils of the Denver Post, who used journalistic blackmail trying to get $1 million and actually got $250,000, were the villains. There were also great newspapers, including the New York Times, which did everything to prevent a congressional investigation. Certainly, the first occupancy of the White House by a publisher was a tragic fiasco. Better men than Harding have tried before and after him. Horace Greeley, if one judges his character from his biographies, would probably have been the Theodore Roosevelt of his time, a pugnacious, single-tracked, but powerful, dynamic president who would have left colorful rather than disgraceful pages in history. Of Alf M. Landon and his journalistic mate Frank Knox, their backers in 1936 expected nothing but a safe and sane, quiet and honest administration, with big business legally flourishing at the expense of the people, as it did under Coolidge and Hoover and Mellon for a while. The nomination of Frank Knox, it has been said in public political speeches, caused abysmal chagrin to his Chicago colleague, Colonel McCormick. I do not know whether this is so, but Frank Knox's candidacy, despite its failure, has caused a great buzzing of hornets in all the bonnets of big and little publishers, and chiefly in the dovecote of the country chain owner Frank E. Gannett. He too has been afflicted with the Northcliffe complex. The list of American publishers who either want to rule or to manipulate the strings of the stooges who rule is an imposing one and keeps growing. In fact, the situation poses the question whether or not most publishers, realizing the power of the press, do not at some time in their lives succumb to the desire to exercise it for their own advancement or satisfactions. Curiously enough, in years gone by, Frank Gannett used to deliver a pronunciamento against publishers in politics. Frank Ernest Gannett is sincere, humanitarian, a man of good intentions, and one of the most confused persons in public life today. As millionaire owners of the press go, he is one of the minor lords, his fortune being valued at a mere $12,500,000. He has great plans for devoting it to the welfare of his fellow men. He has announced that public service, rather than private profits, would be the program of his papers. His chain, which once reached a maximum of 19, is concentrated mostly in New York State, and the best-known papers are the Knickerbocker Press in Albany, and the Rochester Times-Union, and Rochester Democrat and Chronicle. Gannett has provided for a foundation which will control the ownership of the common stock in all his papers. After dividends on preferred, which will be held largely by employees and executives, have been paid, the remaining profits will be available for, quote, public, charitable, educational, and general philanthropic causes and purposes, unquote. The board of directors, self-perpetuating, will consist of 11 persons, of whom at least 8 must be newspapermen, and each director must hold at least 100 shares of stock. The consolidated net profit of the Gannett Company in 1937 was $1,123,085, and in 1936, $1,026,150. In 1935, Gannett also announced that The Agriculturalist, his farm paper, would be directed by a man chosen by the readers, profits to be turned into a fellowship fund for research. When he went to high school in Bristol, New York, where he was born on September 15, 1876, young Gannett made some money as a bartender's helper in the local hotel, and the result was his almost fanatical prohibitionist attitude. He says, quote, after watching booze ruin men, I made up my mind that if I ever got a chance, I would fight it, unquote. He fought. The Prohibition Amendment was a great personal triumph, the repeal a sad day. But when beer returned, and the question of alcohol advertising agitated many publishers, he said, quote, I must recognize that a newspaper is a semi-public institution. No matter what my personal views may be, I have to appreciate that it may be dangerous to exclude advertising not in conflict with the law. It threatens free speech and a free press, which are precious liberties, unquote. So it looked for a while as if private profits would triumph over idealism, but it turned out differently. The childhood conviction did triumph. Gannett again barred liquor advertising in his papers. The war also taught Mr. Gannett something. He has been militantly anti-militarist. He is a member of the Executive Board of the National Council for the Prevention of War. In 1935, Gannett was elected a director of the Associated Press to succeed Adolph Ochs. At that time, he held 17 franchises for that many journals, and it was generally agreed that he would be the spokesman of the small newspaper in the great organization. In the press associations, Gannett is said to be the best versed economist in the profession. Editor and publisher reports that, quote, book upon book in the elaborate office library in his Rochester home testify to the thorough study of economic problems Mr. Gannett has made in recent years, unquote. Apparently, this economist believes in cyclical recovery. Quote, believing that the depression was due largely to a collapse in prices caused by the increasing value of gold, Mr. Gannett is vitally concerned with the effect of a managed dollar, unquote. The economist is quoted as saying, quote, America is practically the same as it was in 1929. We have the same resources, the same etc., etc. Readjust prices, and we will go forward rapidly toward prosperity. Prices affect our lives profoundly. Depressions and booms are just great fluctuations in prices, unquote. Years ago, Gannett announced that it was his policy, quote, never to buy a paper where the policy has to be changed, unquote. It was not until midsummer in 1936 that his publisher joined the vast majority of his colleagues who, for diverse reasons, chiefly financial, as the New York Daily News showed, indulged in one of the most prejudiced, unfair, and unethical campaigns in our history. Said Gannett, quote, I am personally very fond of President Roosevelt. We have been friends for 30 years, but I can't go along with him on his ideas of government. I can't stand for his planned economy, centralization of power, and extravagant use of public monies, unquote. From now on, Gannett was launched on the dubious waters of party politics. He still continued to publish the statement that, quote, the Gannett newspapers are dedicated to the welfare of all the people. Theirs is the pledge to publish each day clean, wholesome, educational, and entertaining newspapers, knowing no selfish interests, no entangling obligations. Each newspaper within this group can be, and is, fair, just, and tolerant, ever sympathetic with the unfortunate, and eager to present all sides of any question. Each of these newspapers has, ever before it, the ideal of Lincoln, to be for and of the people, unquote. And the Knickerbocker Press still announced its purpose was, quote, fully, honestly, accurately, and intelligently to inform the public, unquote. The slogan of the group still was, quote, the integrity of a Gannett newspaper must never be questioned, unquote. But questioned it was. The altruist and humanitarian Gannett came into conflict with the employer Gannett, and the newspapermen who were organizing soon found out which of the two they were dealing with. There were problems of journalistic ethics and problems of hiring, firing, and paying of wages. Gannett was anti-Roosevelt on the Supreme Court issue. The reporters may have been pro-Roosevelt, but they, at least, were ethical. They wrote the news as news. Albany Central Federation of Labor unanimously endorsed the president. This, of course, was fairly big local news, and Albany newspapers were expected to play it up. At the same time, 2 small items came in over the telegraph desk from Schenectady and from Little Falls. They were reports that lawyers' associations had disapproved of the president. On February 18, 1937, the Knickerbocker Press ran its story with the following head: 2 bar groups wrap court move. Mohawk Valley lawyers express disapproval of proposal. Tacked on to out-of-town items was the vastly more important local story in favor of the Roosevelt plan. The reporters were angry. They declared that the Labor Council story had been written separately, but the editors had buried it. That whole morning the telephone calls to the evening Gannett paper, the Albany News, brought protests from labor unions. And so, despite the fact that the news was already stale, having appeared in a morning paper, the news played it up first on page 4, then page 2, with an 8-column banner heading. And when the newspaper writers suggested that a clause in the new contract should permit them to write, quote, a full, accurate, truthful, and fair presentation of the facts, unquote, the management said such a proposal would be virtually an insult to Frank Gannett and the integrity of his newspapers. In January 1938, the Tri-City Newspaper Guild, at a labor board hearing, charged the Gannett firm with using stool pigeons, strikebreakers, and finks during a printer strike, and with the discriminatory discharge of guild members, no less than 27 of the 29 persons fired when the press and news were amalgamated, being members of the organization. The Guild accused the editors and publishers of a 3-year campaign aimed at breaking one of the strongest newspaper groups in the country. The Gannett firm, of course, denied that unfair labor practices had been employed, but it could not deny the firing of 29 men, nor the fact that Mr. Gannett was planning to devote his millions for charitable purposes after he died. Also, shortly after this wholesale discharge of employees, Gannett went deep into political waters, with a recovery plan in which profit-sharing of capital and labor was one of the main points. It would, he said, quote, establish confidence between labor and capital, and promote friendly relations, and bring about real cooperation for the production of more wealth, unquote. One can justly ask whether this was mere mental confusion or Machiavellianism. At home, Mr. Gannett was fighting labor, firing his men, but at the Union League Club of Chicago, he was speaking for sharing the wealth of production with labor. The rest of Gannett's political credo was mostly pro-big business. It consists of the following points. 1. Abolish surplus profit tax and capital gains tax. 2. Abandon economy of scarcity. 3. Encourage business and help make business profitable. 4. Encourage distribution of profits among workers. 5. Cut down government expenses. 6. Lessen taxation because it burdens all. 7. Study English system of labor relations and adopt English system of compulsory arbitration. 8. Establish honest monetary system. 9. Set up long-term planning board to handle public works, high-speed toll roads. 10. Set up Central Information Bureau on production and consumption in order to help business stabilize production. 11. End restrictions on farm production arrange for distribution of surpluses. 12. Promote economy of abundance, more production, lower prices, put idle millions back to work. Shades of Adam Smith, Ricardo, Karl Marx, and Thorsten Veblen. Can this be the result of white knights among those books in the elaborate home study? Or is this purely Republican Party economics? With the announcements of principles and platform, Frank Gannett began organizing his plan to defeat practically all liberal and progressive measures in Washington. His first move was to write 35,000 prominent men to help his drive against the reform of the Supreme Court. His second was to fight the reorganization bill. This fight, as is now generally known, was directed not so much against a necessary measure as against the Roosevelt idea of government by reform. Gannett sent every editor in the country an appeal to help the National Committee to uphold constitutional government, as he called his organization. Most editors who replied were favorable. An exception was William T. Evjew of the Progressive, who wrote Gannett that, quote, he and the crowd surrounding him are actuated by special interests in fighting Roosevelt. The reference to the freedom of the press in the voluminous literature is becoming more and more nauseating. You big moguls in the American Publishers Association are hypocritically using the freedom of the press to promote your own special interests. I am not going to help you play the game of the selfish big newspaper publishers who hate the Roosevelt administration because the Roosevelt administration hasn't been willing to follow the traditional policy of treating big newspapers as a privileged class, unquote. When the Supreme Court plan was defeated, editor and publisher said history would record that the name of Frank E. Gannett, quote, perhaps will stand out as the individual outside official life who contributed most to its rejection, unquote. It described the way in which Gannett used all the power of his newspapers and, quote-unquote, personal efforts. The general roundup of legislation defeated in the session was headlined, Journalism Had Stellar Roles in Current Congress Session. In his second attack on the reorganization measure, Gannett ran into senatorial opposition. An investigation was proposed of his organization, administration leaders demanding to know who, besides Gannett, were investing their money, quote, in defeating all legislation, unquote, and what men were really back of it. This information Gannett, a newspaper publisher whose business it is to inform the public of such matters for the general welfare, refused to divulge. He yelled, "Freedom of the press!" Among those who denied the Senate's power to issue subpoenas and to ask indiscreet questions was Gannett's manager of the committee, a certain Dr. Edward A. Rumley, a wartime pro-German propagandist who, with the aid of pro-Germans, bought the New York Evening Mail for the purpose of presenting the Kaiser's cause. Mussolini had sold out to the French Foreign Office, and thousands of editors and publishers everywhere were being bought by either the Kaiser or the Northcliffe Commission. But it was unfortunate for Dr. Rumley that he was on the wrong side, because he was convicted of trading with the enemy and sentenced to serve a year and a day in the federal penitentiary in Atlanta. Among the measures Rumley admitted his committee fought against was the first Wages and Hours Bill. Senator Minton, in a radio address, said, quote, "Don't be misled by Mr. Gannett, as he directs his propaganda machine from sunny Florida. He has no more idea of saving you and your Constitution than the Liberty League did. If you are gullible, you might be persuaded by the flood of misleading propaganda being sent out by Gannett's committee. Mr. Gannett's speech the other night, that our procedure was unheard of, was deliberately falsifying the record. Mr. Gannett, being a newspaper man, saw the metropolitan newspapers losing their influence with the people. With radios in as many homes as take newspapers, the people began to catch on that the metropolitan newspapers were propaganda sheets that didn't hesitate to misrepresent the facts in their news columns. So Mr. Gannett, seeing the newspapers slipping, set up a propaganda organization on a direct-by-mail basis. Let me nail another falsehood of Mr. Gannett's." Unquote. Parentheses. The rest of this speech may be found in the Congressional Record of March 28, 1938. End parentheses. Minton and fellow senators demanded the facts about the men and money behind Gannett, but the humanitarian replied by shouting, "Fascist dictatorship!" and "Stalin OGPU!" at the inquisitors. The truth never came out. It is known that a huge sum was spent, and that the reorganization bill, which conservative weekly Time admitted was, quote, "a straightforward attempt to increase efficiency," unquote, and could not be presented as, quote, "an effort on the part of Franklin Roosevelt to make himself dictator," unquote, was defeated by a combination of publishers and politicians, notably Gannett, Roy Howard, William Randolph Hearst, Paul Block, Dorothy Thompson, Father Coughlin, and other reactionary forces whose claim was exactly that which Time had denied. Gannett accepted his laurels like a modest hero. He made a radio speech in which he fixed the responsibility for the Depression on the Roosevelt administration and called the Wagner Act, quote, "a potent factor in promoting strife," unquote, which had discouraged production. This short history of Frank E. Gannett shows that he has fought his own employees, used his newspapers to present his personal views, made use of all the usual typographical devices of playing news up or down, that he has made his chain the expression of a narrow and prejudiced policy, that he has never supported liberal measures, and that he has, on the other hand, advocated ideas inimical to labor. Years earlier, he had been in debt heavily to the Power and Paper Trust, but within 48 hours after an exposure by federal authorities, he switched the loans to a bank. In the Tugwell Pure Food and Drug Bill fight, he offered the chain of newspapers to the drug makers and advertising men for the free expression of their opinion. Give it over to the pharmaceuticals. Great. Altogether, it may be said that Gannett is the typical small-town publisher. The difference is that he has humanitarian ideas as well as presidential ambitions. And with his devotion to the latter motivation in the past 2 or 3 years, it is becoming more and more apparent that the humanitarian headlines will not be written in his lifetime. Post-mortem Gannett may become known as a social instead of an antisocial personality. All right, folks, that was Chapter 15 of Lords of the Press by George Seldes. We will be back with Chapter 16 in a couple of minutes. We're back. Time for Chapter 16 of Lords of the Press by George Seldes from 1938. Chapter 16, Boston, Brahmins, Bourgeois, and Boobs. If it is true that cities get the newspapers they deserve, and I doubt it because I believe many benighted cities in America deserve at least one good paper, then Boston would be the place to prove the aphorism. It gets its Christian Science monitor for its 2,817 Christian Scientists, the latest World Almanac figures, its Transcript for its Brahmins, its Globe, Post, Herald, and Traveler for its Bourgeois, and its Record and American for those whose mentality hardly rises above the Hearst or comic strip level. Of all the great cities in America, Boston, which once had the reputation of being intelligent, has the lowest ranking, judged by journalistic standards. In fact, it is the only city which had, until such time as they could not stomach association with vital and progressive force, newspaper guild units which themselves were red-baiting and reactionary. Boston, like New York, has 2 Hearst newspapers, but unlike New York, Boston has no liberal or even semi-liberal newspapers, and it is therefore easier to resort to the crudest methods without fear of collegial criticism or exposure. Hearst papers in Boston are notorious for, quote-unquote, making the news. Public opinion frequently is influenced by stories which originate not in events but in the minds of editors. On the Hearst papers, says the Institute for Propaganda Analysis, it is the incompetent reporter, indeed, quote, who cannot arouse public opinion to fever pitch at 20 minutes' notice, and with only the help of the nearest telephone book, unquote. The system is simple. The reporter calls 10 or 12 notable people, men and women he knows, and who may owe him a favor, or who are dogs for personal publicity, or who happen to have such a perverted political mind that they agree with Hearstian policies, and each person makes a statement suggested by the reporter. The statements are then collected under a general quote-unquote lead, and the story appears on page 1 of the Hearst papers under headlines which begin, Public Decries, or Patriotic Leaders Endorse, ... Of course, the other newspapers do the same thing when they ride their pet hobby horses into the political arena. In the Hearst press, the same trickery is used in the general red-baiting campaign in every town. It is very easy to call up the head of the American Legion, the leading daughter of the American Revolution, the loudest knight of Columbus or other Catholic organization with which Hearst has worked ever since he married a Catholic, and then start a Red Scare. The fact that most of the endorsers of Hearst scares made fools of themselves when the campaigns against colleges, college professors, labor organizations, and individuals have been exposed, and Hearst-sponsored legislation has been found to be as stupid as it was sinister, has never deterred the quote-unquote patriots from endorsing. In Boston, the old-style venality, so usually denied by publishers, still flourishes in the old-style way, with the public utilities, the department stores, the beer manufacturers, and other interests suppressing news right and left, chiefly right. Most of the papers do a little red-baiting now and then, but the Hearst Boston American leads the pack. Since there is no real liberal paper to criticize it, as there is in other cities, the Hearst sheet is more reckless there and vicious in its methods. One of its tricks is to manufacture the news. Just as its reporters make what they call public opinion by getting their friends or Hearst's friends to endorse a Hearst idiosyncrasy, so they also make stories by their own actions. The appointment of Granville Hicks to a fellowship at Harvard University was an example. Hicks is one of the leading literary critics in America. He happens to belong to the Communist Party, just as other literary figures and Harvard professors happen to belong to the Republican and Democratic parties. Under the law of the land, these three parties are equal in everything, and membership in one or the other cannot be a bar to the enjoyment of everything the Constitution guarantees citizens. This fact, however, is either unknown to or ignored by Hearst editors, and Hearst reporters who are forever apologizing for the quote-unquote dirty things they have to do in the Hearst service, like the hounding of Lindbergh, for example, instigated actions in Boston in an effort to drive Hicks out of Harvard. Boston American reporters got 20 members of the Grand Army of the Republic to protest, and then reported the protest as quote-unquote spontaneous. They also influenced the Watertown Lodge of Elks to take similar action. The national commander of the American Legion, Daniel J. Dougherty, whom decent and intelligent well-wishers of the Legion expected to put an end to its long records of red-baiting, joined the Hearst movement. But even that was not enough for Hearst. Someone on the American got the brilliant idea that there should be a student revolt. Accordingly, the reporters were sent out to stir one up. They circulated in Harvard Yard with petitions, asking all and sundry to attach their names. But even the conservative lads, who people Harvard nowadays, are getting too wise to play the stooges for Hearst newspapers, and very few lent their rich and aristocratic names to the American's representative. This fact, however, did not deter the editors from using the previously prepared headline, "Students Revolt on Red Professor," which led one day's paper. The next day, to Hearst's consternation, the Harvard Young Conservatives, the most reactionary student group in a university not well known any longer as the leading institution for fostering liberal, enlightened, and progressive thought, actually announced its approval of Granville Hicks to a fellowship. And that was the end of Hearst trickery in that affair. However, on the 2nd of May, the Hearst press in Boston notably, and in New York, and elsewhere to some extent, had another chance for sensational red-baiting. The news fact concerned an attack on 3 nuns near Saints Peter and Paul Cathedral in Providence. It is a fact that Bishop Francis P. Kiao told the press he quote-unquote suspected the attack to be due to a campaign by communists, a charge for which he had no ground whatsoever except his own hatred of communists. However, the slanderous charge made by a high clergyman gave that section of the press, which also engages in red-baiting, an opportunity to do so, and lay the blame on a person of some standing in the community. The Hearst headlines were disgraceful. The story was proven false, and the next day, when Phil Frankfeld, secretary of the Massachusetts Communist Party, protested the, quote, false, deliberately misleading, and slanderous charge, unquote, there was no mention of that in most Hearst papers. The Boston Transcript. For many years, the Boston Transcript has had the reputation of being the journal of the Brahmins. In more recent times, it has become a little more popular in its headlines and makeup, but it is still the only newspaper which one can pick up and read a headline such as the following. Yikes, and the following is Latin. Inertes ignave fuimos opere pretium fuit de praeteritorium memoria per annos quaetor in collegio Harvardiense. Wow, you know you're uppity when you're reading that. Underneath, in the issue of June 24th, 1937, followed the Harvard commencement Latin oration by Laird Mackay. Ogle, but the, quote, little old lady in black bombazine, unquote, never felt it necessary to tell its readers that its headline meant, quote, we have been lazy and ignorant, but it was worth it, quote, or unquote, quote, memories concerning happenings of the past 4 years in Harvard College, unquote. Moreover, the story made page 1. This same aristocratic newspaper, however, will defend child labor and even publish a pamphlet on, quote-unquote, the newspaper boy. The Transcript also refused to publish the news about one of its advertisers who refused to obey a minimum wage law board's decision, and an advertisement naming the firm, despite the fact the state law provides a fine of $100 upon newspapers refusing or neglecting to publish the findings of the commission. Some years ago, when Dr. Charles Harrington, health officer, investigated the breweries and found that beer was being adulterated with salicylic and fluoric acids, he succeeded in getting jury indictments. Hearst published the facts because he was starting a campaign for circulation, but the Boston Transcript did not mention Red Fox Ale being indicted. Neither did the Globe or Post mention the matter. Later, Harvard Beer was indicted. In both instances, the Boston papers, and notably the Transcript, carried beer advertisements of these concerns. In the first instance, the Transcript published a list of indictments, cutting out the name of the advertiser. 3 days after the Harvard Beer indictment, moreover, the good old Transcript carried the first of a series of larger-than-usual advertisements which proclaimed Harvard Beer, 1,000% pure. Today, I doubt the possibility of Harvard Beer or any other advertiser being able to suppress an important news item in the Transcript. I do not believe that the Transcript is venal. I am sure that if an advertiser came into the office and attempted to bribe an editor or publisher, he would not only be thrown out on his ear, but the paper would publish the facts in the case and an added exposure of the attempted corruption. But I am just as certain that the Transcript would never endanger either $1's worth of legitimate advertising or a cent's worth of the status quo by publishing news or editorials harmful to either. However, there is some hope that the reorganization, as of September 1938, will be followed by a more liberal policy. The Christian Science Monitor. The Christian Science Monitor is unique. It is the only national newspaper we have. The New York Times has a national influence and can be called a national newspaper on that account, but it is not published for national circulation, as is the Monitor. The latter is also a non-commercial enterprise. It is therefore one of the few papers which can call itself free. The only chains it wears is that of the church which subsidizes it. A circulation of about 125,000 is nothing compared to any of the mob newspapers, but nevertheless the Monitor is probably as powerful an organ as a combination of papers serving many millions. Every subscriber to the Christian Science Journal can be put down as a man or woman belonging to the upper brackets in the income tax returns, of considerable culture and influence, and an influence in local or national affairs. There are practically no poor Christian scientists in America, and none with the low IQ which make up the readership of the yellow press. Oswald Garrison Villard wrote an essay on the Monitor many years ago, and said he was, quote, hopeful that in the future struggle between the two great groups of thought in America, between the powers of privilege and the masses of the people, unquote, this paper's voice, quote, will be heard on the side of the masses rather than of the privileged, unquote, but that day has not yet arrived. On the other hand, it must be said that the Monitor is fairer to the masses than the New York Times, and a vast majority of the hypocritical press which proclaims itself the organ of millions. The Monitor is the property of the trustees of the Christian Science Publishing Committee, its directors being the directors of the First Church of Christ Scientists in Boston, the Mother Church. The paper was established, quote, to publish the real news of the world in clean, wholesome manner, devoid of the sensation methods, no exploitation or illustration of vice or crime, but the aim of the editors will be to issue a paper which will be welcomed in every home where purity and refinement are cherished ideals, unquote. Christian Science itself is expounded in only a few columns on one page. The rest of the paper is a newspaper. There are, of course, tremendous censorships at work, not the least of which are against fraudulent advertising. There is no drug advertising whatever, of course, and none of the phony sales by department or other stores which contribute so much of the revenue of the commercial newspaper. The Monitor would probably be the only newspaper whose advertising columns could pass a consumers' union test or any ethical test. The Monitor is not anti-advertising. Its advertising manager, Norman S. Rose, believes there are 3 reasons for bad advertising: greed, selfishness, and fear. He explains, quote, greed. Get the results, get the business, get the money. No matter how you advertise in order to get it, just get it. Selfishness. Don't pay any attention to the effect that what you are doing may have on the interests of others. Just look out for yourself. Fear. Fear that sane, decent advertising won't work, and that you've got to drag your copy through the gutter to make it outsmell and outsell your competitors. Fear on the part of such advertisers that a day of reckoning is not far off, when either the advertising profession itself or outside forces will clean up advertising practices, and that they'd better hurry up and sell as much of their wretched stuff as they can before somebody stops them, unquote. Mr. Rose closes his criticism with an apostrophe. He exclaims, quote, "If these three things could be eliminated from the thoughts and motives of mankind," unquote. It is impossible to imagine any advertising man, except the monitors, expressing such an ideal thought. In its news columns, the Monitor has always given space to peace in the midst of all wars. In 1935, it covered the Italian attack on Ethiopia thoroughly and fairly. It published an editorial the first day saying, quote, "In reporting as a newspaper the story of warlike measures or war, the Monitor, as a Christian Science publication, also bespeaks its readers' attention to the fact of peace," unquote. More analytically than most papers, it published the basic causes of the war and showed the part the munitions trade is playing throughout the world. Wow, that's great. Somebody at least, huh? In national and local politics, the Monitor is independent. This means independent in the dictionary sense, not in the sense of a great number of our newspapers which so style themselves, despite an unbroken record of subservience to the political machines, both Democratic and Republican. The Monitor is sold on its merits. The Church does not ask anyone to buy it. Many non-scientists also believe it is the ideal newspaper of our time and of all times. Hearst. The stupidities and crudities of the Hearst Boston newspapers in the 1936 election campaign may seem ridiculous today, but the reader must remember that, despite the general disgust with Hearst throughout the nation, he still has numerous followers in the former hub of American civilization. The city teems with the lumpen proletariat, the ignorant and betrayed working men who, in foreign countries, form the vanguard of a fascist dictator's labor army, and who, in America, blindly follow Huey Longs and Father Coughlins, rather than those who teach them their own self-interests. That's cool. I like that. He's nailing both sides. What he would, I'm sure, label, I think, the extreme left and the extreme right. The Huey Longs and the Father Coughlins. You got socialism and communism maybe and fascism there. Continuing. The lumpen proletariat makes up the Hearst readership everywhere. In Boston, the American claims it has more than 261,000 circulation, the largest of any evening newspaper. In the 1936 campaign, it ran a heading, "Shall it be freedom or dictatorship?" Oh, wow. And these are the papers that got us into the 1898 war against Spain. And you think the USS Maine wasn't an inside job? Wow. Shall it be freedom or dictatorship? Suggesting that Roosevelt meant the latter. Well, he did mean socialism, but dictatorship was a ways off yet. We have an oligarchy, though. Certainly by now. Probably by then, too. Back then. Continuing. It called the security law a wage cut and said Landon would end it. It published the most absurd story by Harold Lloyd Varney, headed "Tugwell, Prompter of Roosevelt." And for weeks it republished its bon com under such headings as "Boston Communists Drop Mask," "Open Drive to Defeat Landon," and "Reds Unmasked in Move to Elect Roosevelt." You know what? This is just funny. And it's I don't fully agree with the author in that Roosevelt was a socialist, and the same people the same Wall Street financiers who backed Roosevelt also backed Stalin and Hitler. That's a fact. Anthony Sutton showed that in 3 books: Wall Street and the Rise of and the Rise of Hitler, Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution, and Wall Street and FDR. It's an irrefutable fact. However, to read headlines like this in the paper, how bold and upfront. It's just humorous. In the issue of October 28, 1936, the American gives special emphasis to Catholics, urging them to beware the Communist Party, then proceeds to link the latter with the Roosevelt elector who favored the Spanish Republic. The falsehood concerning, quote, the suppression of all religion, unquote, in Spain is repeated. As a rule, newspapermen do not believe what they read in the papers, or have faith in the papers themselves. At least the intelligent ones do not. Parentheses. There are, of course, the exceptions, when the paper happens to be a great newspaper, but such instances are few. End parenthesis. The average reporter has been pictured as a cynic, a wisecracker, a souse, 3 angles on the behavior pattern which perhaps betray a road of escape or a valid reaction to the ancient and by now almost forgotten accusation that there was a relationship between the words journalism and prostitution. In the history of the American Newspaper Guild, there have been instances of disputes among newspaper men themselves. The supposition that reporters are at least intelligent enough to know the fundamental facts about their own interests and the strengths that come with organization was proven false in some cases, and in others the love of the bordellos was found stronger than the new freedom which beckoned. In Boston, the Guild had the strange experience of meeting a group of Hearst men who believed in the Hearst propaganda. They also have swallowed Hearst bunk against loyalist Spain. Among the 20 or 30,000 volunteers who came to the Republic's aid was Ben Leader, an aviator and guildsman, who was shot down after a heroic fight with the fascists. A Ben Leader Memorial Fund had been organized, and President Brune of the Guild asked units to contribute. The Boston Daily Record Guild thereupon countersigned a letter from Harry Benwell, in which he said, quote, I am going to mind my own damn business. The late Mr. Leader may have been a hero, but the fact he gave his life fighting for Spanish communists is nothing for American newspaper men to get excited about. It seems to me it is going to be difficult to put ourselves over the publishers if we openly align ourselves with Reds whose avowed purpose is to overturn capitalism, unquote. In December 1937, the Daily Record and the American Guilds quit the national organization and joined the American Federation of Labor. Telegrams from the Hearst Mirror and Journal American units in New York asking Boston to remain in the CIO were left unanswered. Representatives of Boston Guild headquarters who tried to address the Hearst meeting were not allowed to speak. Parenthesis. The Hearst men's idea of a free press is apparently a denial of free speech. End parenthesis. The bourgeois, as well as the boob papers, go in for red baiting in Boston. It is a Catholic town, and the Catholic hierarchy press has gone in for unadulterated red baiting itself, and apparently the word has been passed on from the various quote-unquote powerhouses that this quote-unquote party line shall be pursued everywhere. When the Spanish Republic's ambassador visits Boston, he receives no police escort, no public acclaim, and certainly no press headlines. When Fulvio Suvic, the Italian ambassador, arrives, Governor Hurley, Mayor Tobin, and ex-Governor Curley, Commendatore of the Order of Italy, and the press and public reply to his fascist salute with an ovation and delirious newspaper columns. When a bill is introduced to end child labor, the Catholic reactionaries get the publicity. The Catholic liberal view gets none. The Traveler calls the proposed constitutional amendment, quote, a carefully worded piece of radical legislation designed to rob parents of their rights over children and transfer control of every child up to 18 years of age to a bureaucratic group in Washington, unquote. Well, sorry, side note, this is just me talking. Your children are not your children. You got a marriage license and a birth certificate. You gave your child to the state. Period. End of story. Continuing. Apparently there are Bostonians benighted enough to believe such nonsense. When the WPA guidebook published the mildest sort of factual statement about the Sacco Vanzetti case, the judicial murder of two radicals whose innocence has been proven beyond the shadow of question, the Boston press, excepting, of course, the Intelligent Monitor, grew hysterical at what it considered an insult to the great Commonwealth of Massachusetts. With red baiting come the usual corollaries: anti-labor, pro-corporation, anti-guild, pro-utilities, anti-liberal, and pro-department store policies. These can be seen at work more clearly in Boston newspapers than elsewhere. Herald and Traveler. In 1929, the Boston Herald and the Boston Traveler were exposed as being part of that vast newspaper empire which the International Paper and Power Company had built. Its defense that it was merely assuring an outlet for print paper was disproved by the fact that it was largely a power corporation, and immediately afterward Frank Gannett of the Brooklyn Eagle, and likewise the two Boston papers, rushed out of the poison gas clouds the federal investigation had spread over press ownership. This action was applauded generally, and so today we have the Boston newspapers controlled by the United Shoe Machinery Corporation, those directors, instead of the IP&P Corporation. In fact, the Traveler and Herald are connected with many of the major banking interests of New England. Their president is S.W. Winslow, Jr., who, in addition to the shoe directorship, is director of the, you guessed it, Morgan-affiliated First National Bank of Boston and the John Hancock Mutual Life, banking and insurance, of course, and U.S. Smelting. G.R. Brown, another director, also directs shoe and banks. J.L. Hall, vice president, directs Westinghouse, New York, New Hampshire, and Hartford. Channing H. Cox is president of Old Colony Trust and director in United Fruit. Oh, they've got a nice sordid history. United Fruit. Those are the ones that launched their own private war in Guatemala and overthrew the duly elected representative there. Well, they had the CIA on their side, of course. The Boston Herald Traveler Corporation is known as the wealthiest newspaper outfit in New England. When the Guild asked for an increase in wages in 1938, the management replied that business conditions made it impossible. The Guild discovered that the corporation had a surplus of $5,035,401 in 1936 and paid $1 million in dividends in 1937. Its net profits had been running from $600,000 to $900,000 in Depression years. The Guild vote of 105 to 19 to strike won them a contract which meant the corporation would have to pay its employees $100,000 a year more. The editorial pages of the Herald and Traveler are violently anti-CIO. They deplore strikes, they denounce picketing, they believe the 1936 sit-down strikes were criminal actions, and they mask their big business special pleading by pretending that all they say is in the interests of the general public, whatever that may be. I also have a collection of Boston Herald front-page news stories dealing with strikes and violence, signed by Russell B. Porter. These dispatches are about 95% the same as the Porter stories in the New York Times. The 5% differences, however, are significant. In the Boston paper, labor is reviled. Vigilantes are approved. Strikers are charged with violence. The police and legionnaires are praised. All this is done by changing a few words or purposeful editing. In the New York paper, labor is not treated in too friendly a way, but in Boston it actually gets a raw deal. But what is one to expect in a press largely owned by the United Shoe Machinery Corporation and the leading banks of New England? A social conscience? Okay, folks, those were chapters 15 and 16 from Lords of the Press by George Seldes from 1938. You've been listening to Rejected Knowledge.